3 weeks after exchanging vows in front of tearful families, newlyweds Marcus Chen and Sofia Rivera promised her worried mother they'd stick to marked trails during their Utah honeymoon adventure. For 5 years, the only trace was their abandoned camp in Zion's backcountry, so perfectly preserved it defied explanation. Then a wildlife photographer's shocking discovery in a hidden canyon would reveal the primitive horror that claimed their lives. Before continuing this amazing story, let us know where you watching from today. The GPS tracker was supposed to be the peace offering, the technological bridge between young love's desire for adventure and a mother's need for reassurance. It was a sleek device, waterproof and solar-powered, designed to ping satellite coordinates every 4 hours from the most remote corners of the American wilderness. For Elena Rivera, it was the only reason she had managed to smile through her daughter's wedding reception while knowing that in just 3 weeks, Sofia and her new husband would be venturing into the unforgiving terrain of southern Utah. It was Monday morning, July 16, 2018. The young couple had been due back the previous evening. Elena had expected a call around 7 p.m. on Sunday, the customary check-in filled with Sofia's infectious laughter and breathless descriptions of red rock canyons and hidden waterfalls that had captured her heart during their honeymoon exploration. But 7 p.m. came and went. By 9 p.m., the familiar knot of maternal worry had begun to form in her stomach. By 11 p.m., she was clutching her phone, calling both their numbers repeatedly, only to hear the immediate, hollow echo of voicemails that indicated their devices were either powered down or completely beyond the reach of any cellular tower. This wasn't entirely surprising. The Zion wilderness was notorious for its communication dead zones, vast stretches where modern technology simply couldn't penetrate the maze of slot canyons and towering sandstone walls. But they were supposed to be out of the backcountry by then, back at their rental car in the designated parking area, driving toward their hotel in Springdale where they planned to spend their final night before flying home to California. By Monday morning, the worry had transformed into something much darker. Elena contacted Marcus's parents, David and Lynn Chen, who were experiencing the same escalating panic from their home in San Francisco. The consensus was immediate and terrifying. Something was fundamentally wrong. Elena sat at her kitchen table, her laptop open before her, hands shaking as she navigated to the GPS tracking website. Sofia and Marcus had initially resisted taking the device. At 24 and 22 respectively, they felt invincible, experienced hikers who had conquered challenging trails throughout California and Nevada during their 2-year courtship. They argued it was invasive monitoring, an unnecessary intrusion on their honeymoon privacy. But both families had been unwavering in their insistence. After the recent headlines about missing hikers in national parks, it was absolutely non-negotiable. Reluctantly, Marcus had attached the tracker to his pack with a carabiner, joking that it made him feel like a tagged wildlife specimen. The tracking interface materialized on Elena's screen, displaying a detailed topographical map of the Zion wilderness area. Her eyes immediately searched for the most recent location ping, the digital breadcrumb that would indicate their safe progress through the planned route. But the coordinates hadn't moved. The map showed a single stationary cluster of GPS points, all emanating from the same location deep within the designated wilderness area. According to the timestamp, the device had last transmitted from that remote spot over 36 hours ago. Since Saturday evening, there had been complete digital silence. No movement indicators, no manual check-in messages that the device allowed users to send. And most critically, no emergency SOS beacon had been activated. The stillness of that solitary digital marker felt profoundly ominous, suggesting that the device, and perhaps Sofia and Marcus themselves, had ceased all movement long before their scheduled return. Elena immediately called the Washington County Sheriff's Office to file official missing persons reports. The names Marcus Chen and Sofia Rivera entered the system as active cases requiring immediate attention. To those who knew them, they represented everything bright and hopeful about young love. Marcus, with his infectious optimism and meticulous planning, worked as a software engineer but lived for weekend adventures. Sofia, more spontaneous but equally outdoor savvy, was pursuing her master's degree in environmental science while working part-time at an outdoor gear company. They were both seasoned hikers who understood wilderness safety protocols and respected the potentially deadly nature of desert terrain. This particular honeymoon itinerary had generated considerable discussion among their families. The route they had selected was significantly more remote and challenging than their typical weekend excursions. It involved multiple days of backcountry camping in areas where water sources were scarce and rescue access was extremely limited. But they were legally adults, recently married, and their preparation had been exhaustive. They carried professional-grade equipment, emergency supplies for twice their planned duration, and comprehensive first aid training. Most importantly, they had the GPS tracker that was supposed to ensure they could never truly disappear. As search and rescue teams began mobilizing equipment and personnel, investigators started reconstructing the timeline of the couple's final known activities. Elena provided authorities with recent photographs from the wedding and honeymoon preparation, desperate to give searchers clear, current images to work with. One photograph, taken just 4 days before their departure, captured the essence of their relationship perfectly. The image showed Marcus and Sofia at the Zion National Park Visitor Center, studying trail maps spread across a wooden table. Marcus, wearing a bright blue hiking shirt and khaki shorts, was pointing enthusiastically at something on the map, his face animated with excitement. Sofia, dressed in a coral-colored tank top and hiking pants, was leaning against him, her long dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her expression focused but happy. Behind them, the dramatic red cliffs of Zion Canyon rose like ancient cathedrals, a stunning backdrop that seemed to promise adventure rather than tragedy. Elena confirmed she had taken that photograph on Tuesday, July 10th, during a family visit to help them finalize their route and supply list. The image captured their careful planning and shared enthusiasm, making their subsequent disappearance even more bewildering. As SAR helicopters lifted off from the Springdale airport, heading toward the coordinates provided by the GPS tracker, that image of meticulous preparation stood in stark contrast to the growing dread that something terrible had gone wrong in the wilderness. The coordinates led the search teams into one of the most challenging sections of the Zion Wilderness area. This wasn't tourist-friendly terrain with maintained trails and interpretive signs. It was raw, demanding landscape characterized by narrow slot canyons, crumbling sandstone ledges, and flash flood zones that could transform from dry washes to raging torrents within minutes. The desert environment presented unique challenges for both hikers and searchers. Temperatures could swing 40 degrees between day and night, water sources were unreliable, and the slick rock terrain made tracking nearly impossible. For SAR teams, accessing the remote coordinates required a combination of helicopter insertion and technical rope work to navigate the canyon systems safely. The urgency was palpable. In desert wilderness, dehydration could incapacitate healthy adults within hours, and the July heat was particularly brutal. Every minute counted. Upon reaching the location on Tuesday afternoon, the teams discovered exactly what the GPS coordinates had indicated: an established campsite in a hidden alcove protected by towering sandstone walls. But the scene they encountered didn't provide the straightforward answers they desperately needed. Instead, it presented a puzzle so strange and unsettling that it would haunt the investigation for years to come. The campsite was nestled in a natural amphitheater of red rock, accessible only through a narrow slot canyon that required careful navigation. It was the type of location that experienced desert hikers would recognize as ideal. Sheltered from wind, protected from flash floods, and positioned near a reliable spring that trickled down the canyon wall. Sofia and Marcus's orange three-season tent was properly erected, the rainfly secured against the occasional desert downpour. A carefully constructed fire ring contained cold ashes, indicating no fire had been lit for at least 2 days. Around the immediate area, their gear was distributed with methodical precision. The 2 matching gray backpacks, high-end models designed for multi-day expeditions, were positioned against a smooth boulder, still packed and organized. Inside the tent, investigators found sleeping bags neatly rolled, spare clothing folded, and their remaining food supplies completely untouched and properly stored in bear-resistant containers. Water purification tablets, comprehensive first aid supplies, emergency shelter, navigation equipment, and backup power sources were all present and accounted for. Sitting prominently on a flat sandstone ledge near the fire ring was the GPS tracker, its small LED indicator blinking steadily, faithfully transmitting coordinates to worried families hundreds of miles away. The scene was deeply disturbing precisely because of its complete normalcy. There were no signs of struggle or conflict. The sandy ground showed no evidence of frantic movement or defensive positioning. There was no blood, no torn fabric, no scattered belongings that might indicate a confrontation with wildlife or human threats. The campsite was impeccably organized, with gear stored according to leave no trace principles that both Sofia and Marcus had practiced religiously. It appeared, in every measurable way, as though the newlyweds had simply stood up from their camp chairs and walked away, abandoning everything they needed for survival in one of America's most unforgiving environments. This scenario immediately paralyzed the investigation with fundamental questions that defied logical explanation. Why would two intelligent, experienced hikers who understood the lethal risks of desert wilderness abandon their campsite without water, navigation tools, or emergency communication? Why leave behind their food, their shelter, and most critically, the GPS device that represented their only connection to rescue? The decision contradicted everything known about their training, their personalities, and their demonstrated commitment to safety protocols. The discovery of the abandoned honeymoon camp triggered an immediate and massive expansion of search operations throughout the region. The discovery of the pristine campsite sent shockwaves through the search and rescue community. Within hours, the initial three-person team was reinforced by specialized units from across the region. The scale of the operation quickly expanded to include ground teams, canine units, technical rope rescue specialists, and aerial support specifically equipped for the challenging terrain of Slot Canyon country. The Incident Command Center was established at the Zion Canyon Visitor Center, where Rivera and the Chen family maintained a constant, agonizing vigil. The atmosphere was charged with professional urgency tempered by deep human compassion. Elena, in particular, became a driving force in the search effort, providing investigators with detailed information about the couple's hiking experience, their planned route, and any conversation she could remember about their intentions. Back at the campsite, forensic investigators began the methodical process of examining every item left behind, searching for any clue, however minute, that might explain the couple's inexplicable disappearance. They photographed and cataloged each piece of equipment with scientific precision, looking for signs of damage, disturbance, or anything that might suggest what had motivated Sofia and Marcus to leave their sanctuary. The investigation revealed meticulous preparation that made their disappearance even more baffling. Their backpacks contained detailed topographical maps with their planned route clearly marked in red ink. Emergency contact information was laminated and stored in multiple locations. Their food supply was calculated for exactly 5 days, with emergency rations for 2 additional days. Water purification capabilities included both tablets and a high-end filtration system. They had packed layers for temperature variations, rain gear for sudden storms, and enough medical supplies to handle significant injuries. Everything suggested they understood the risks and had prepared accordingly. Among the personal items discovered inside their tent, investigators found something that offered the first potential insight into their movements. It was Sofia's leather-bound journal, a wedding gift from her maid of honor, dedicated to recording memories from their honeymoon adventure. The final entry, dated Saturday, July 14th, was written in Sofia's distinctive handwriting. The entry was enthusiastic and detailed, describing their successful navigation to the campsite and their amazement at the hidden beauty of their location. She wrote about the spring that provided fresh water, the way the morning light illuminated the canyon walls, and Marcus's excitement about discovering what he believed were ancient petroglyphs on a nearby rock face. But it was the final paragraph that caught the attention of investigators. Marcus found references in his geology textbooks to a hidden waterfall system somewhere in this area. The local Paiute tribe considered it sacred, but early Mormon settlers wrote about finding it in the 1800s. We're going to explore tomorrow morning. Just a day hike from base camp. Marcus thinks it's only a few miles away, following the old water channels carved into the rock. This discovery provided the investigation's first concrete theory about their movements. It suggested that Sofia and Marcus had planned an exploratory day hike from their established campsite, seeking out a legendary waterfall that Marcus had researched in geological surveys and historical accounts. If they intended to travel light and return the same day, it might explain why they had left their heavy backpacks, camping equipment, and survival gear at the base camp. They might have assumed it would be a brief adventure, perhaps 3 or 4 hours of exploration before returning to their honeymoon sanctuary. But this theory, while logical, raised even more disturbing questions. Even if they had become lost during their waterfall search, they were experienced enough to recognize the danger and either retrace their steps or shelter in place until rescue arrived. The search effort intensified, focusing on the drainage systems and canyon networks that might lead to the mythical waterfall Marcus had been seeking. Teams rappelled into slot canyons, following ancient watercourses that had carved labyrinthine passages through the sandstone over millions of years. The terrain was treacherous, with smooth rock surfaces that became deadly slippery when wet and narrow passages that could trap inexperienced explorers. But despite days of exhaustive searching, covering every accessible canyon, ridge, and water feature within a 10-mile radius of their campsite, the teams found nothing. No dropped water bottle bearing their fingerprints. No piece of clothing snagged on the distinctive desert vegetation. No footprints preserved in the rare patches of sand that accumulated in sheltered areas. It was as if the ancient landscape had completely absorbed their presence, leaving no trace of their passage through its secret places. As the search entered its second week, tips and reported sightings began flooding the investigation. The story of the missing newlyweds had captured regional media attention, generating a constant stream of potentially relevant information. One report seemed particularly promising and caused a significant diversion of precious resources and personnel. A gas station attendant in Fredonia, Arizona, a small town approximately 40 miles south of the search area, contacted authorities with a detailed account. He claimed to have encountered 2 young people matching Sofia and Marcus's descriptions on the afternoon of Sunday, July 15th, the day they were supposed to return home. According to his statement, the couple had appeared at his station driving a dusty, older model Jeep Cherokee with Utah plates. The woman, who he said resembled Sofia, seemed agitated and had been asking repeatedly about cell phone reception and the quickest route to Las Vegas. The man had remained in the vehicle, seemingly injured or ill, with what appeared to be a bandage around his head. This potential lead electrified the investigation team. It suggested that Sofia and Marcus had successfully exited the wilderness, but had encountered some form of trouble or threat that prevented them from returning home as planned. The scenario implied they might still be alive, possibly being held against their will or fleeing from some danger they had encountered in the desert. Investigators immediately deployed to Fredonia, interviewing the gas station attendant extensively and reviewing security camera footage from multiple businesses in the area. They spent valuable days attempting to identify the Cherokee and trace its movements, while Elena Rivera and the Chen family waited in excruciating suspense, clinging to the possibility that their loved ones might still be rescued alive. But after thorough investigation, the lead completely disintegrated. The security footage revealed that the couple seen at the gas station bore only superficial resemblance to Sofia and Marcus. The woman was significantly older, and the man's build was entirely different. The Cherokee belonged to tourists from Nevada who were traveling through the area on an unrelated vacation. It was a devastating dead end, a cruel detour that consumed precious time and emotional energy while providing no actual progress in locating the missing newlyweds. The false hope had been particularly brutal for the families, who had allowed themselves to believe that rescue might be imminent. By early August, the summer heat in southern Utah had become almost unbearable. Daytime temperatures regularly exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit, making extended ground searches extremely dangerous for the rescue personnel. The threat of flash floods from afternoon thunderstorms added another layer of complexity to the operation. The massive search effort, which had involved hundreds of specialized personnel, multiple helicopter units, and sophisticated tracking technology, was reluctantly scaled back to essential operations only. The formal active search was suspended pending new evidence or information. The complete absence of any trace of Sofia and Marcus left investigators struggling with a case that seemed to violate the basic laws of physics and human behavior. People simply don't vanish from the wilderness without leaving some evidence of their passage. Especially not experienced hikers carrying modern equipment in terrain that preserves footprints and disturbed vegetation for weeks. The case file was transferred to the Cold Case Division. But the mystery of the perfectly preserved honeymoon campsite continued to generate theories and speculation among search and rescue professionals. Some suggested they had fallen into an unmapped cave system or slot canyon too narrow for aerial detection. Others theorized about a flash flood that had carried them into inaccessible areas downstream. But none of these explanations adequately addressed the central puzzle. Why had they left their campsite without their essential survival equipment? The most experienced desert guides acknowledged that the scenario defied their understanding of wilderness survival instincts and human behavior patterns. 5 years passed with the grinding persistence of unanswered grief. 5 summers where the desert bloomed briefly with rare wildflowers, and 5 winters where snow occasionally dusted the high mesas. The disappearance of Sofia Rivera and Marcus Chen had become part of local folklore, a cautionary tale shared among hikers and park rangers. The initial media frenzy had gradually faded, replaced by the quiet, persistent anguish of families who refused to accept that their children had simply vanished without explanation. Elena Rivera, in particular, never abandoned hope. She organized annual memorial hikes, hired private investigators, and maintained regular contact with Park Service personnel who might encounter new evidence. She kept Sofia's photograph on her desk at work, the same image that had been used in missing persons flyers, Sofia laughing with pure joy, her arm around Marcus at their engagement party, both of them radiant with the anticipation of their future together. That image of unbridled happiness had become a symbol of dreams interrupted, of love cut short by circumstances that no one could explain or understand. The GPS tracker, returned to the family after the investigation was suspended, sat in Elena's bedroom dresser, its battery long dead but its memory still containing those final, haunting coordinates. Sometimes, late at night, Elena would hold the device and wonder what Sofia and Marcus had seen or experienced in those last moments before they walked away from everything that could have saved them. The summer of 2023 arrived with the familiar cycle of tourists and adventurers drawn to Utah's otherworldly landscape. The missing persons posters had long since faded from park bulletin boards, but the mystery remained as compelling and inexplicable as ever. Somewhere in the vast expanse of red rock and hidden canyons, the truth waited to be discovered. The abandoned campsite had become something of a legend among search and rescue personnel in southern Utah. Even years after the active search was called off, veteran SAR members would occasionally mention the Chen Rivera case during training exercises, using it as an example of how wilderness disappearances could defy conventional wisdom and establish search protocols. The campsite itself had been left undisturbed after the initial investigation, sealed off with temporary barriers that had long since weathered away. Park Service regulations required that abandoned gear be removed after 90 days. But the ongoing investigation had granted special exceptions. The tent, backpacks, and equipment remained where Sofia and Marcus had left them, slowly weathering under the relentless desert sun and occasional flash floods. Dr. Rebecca Santos, a wildlife photographer and university professor specializing in desert ecosystems, had been documenting the recovery of bighorn sheep populations in the Zion Wilderness area throughout the summer of 2023. Her research required access to some of the most remote and challenging terrain in the park system, areas where the ancient animals could graze undisturbed by human activity. It was September 12, 2023, exactly 5 years and 2 months since Sofia and Marcus had vanished. Rebecca was tracking a small herd of sheep that had been moving through a particularly isolated canyon system, photographing their behavior and documenting their use of traditional mineral licks that had sustained wildlife for thousands of years. The area she was exploring had never been included in the original search grid for the missing couple. It was located approximately 8 miles northeast of their campsite, accessible only through a series of technical slot canyons that required rappelling equipment and extensive route-finding experience. The terrain was so challenging that even experienced cavers and canyoneers rarely ventured into this section of the wilderness. Rebecca was accompanied by her border collie, Sage, a highly trained search dog who had been cross-trained to detect both wildlife and human scents. The combination made Sage invaluable for Rebecca's research, as the dog could track animal movements while alerting to any human presence that might disturb the wildlife behavior studies. They had been working since dawn, moving slowly through a narrow canyon that wound deeper into the heart of the wilderness area. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the distinctive scent of sage and juniper that characterized the high desert environment. Sandstone walls rose hundreds of feet on either side, creating a natural corridor that filtered the light into dancing patterns of gold and shadow. As they rounded a sharp bend in the canyon, Sage suddenly broke away from the sheep trail they had been following. The dog's behavior changed dramatically, shifting from the focused but calm demeanor of wildlife tracking to something much more intense and agitated. Sage began whining, a high-pitched sound that echoed strangely off the canyon walls, and started pawing frantically at a specific section of the canyon floor. Rebecca initially assumed the dog had detected the scent of a carcass, possibly a sheep that had fallen from the canyon rim or died from natural causes. But Sage's behavior was unlike anything she had observed during their years of fieldwork together. The dog wasn't just alerting to death. He was showing signs of extreme distress, backing away from the scent source while simultaneously being drawn to investigate further. Rebecca approached the area where Sage was focused, a section of the canyon floor where flash flood debris had accumulated over many seasons. The soil was darker here, richer with organic matter that had been deposited during periodic flooding events. Ancient cottonwood logs, polished smooth by decades of water action, were scattered throughout the area. Using her hiking pole, Rebecca began carefully probing the soft soil where Sage continued to show interest. Almost immediately, she encountered something hard buried just inches below the surface. She used her hands to carefully clear away the dirt and decomposed organic matter, expecting to uncover a piece of flood debris or perhaps a large stone. But what emerged from the earth made her stomach lurch with recognition and horror. It was unmistakably human bone, weathered and stained dark brown by the soil but still clearly identifiable. The initial piece appeared to be a section of an arm bone, a humerus, with distinctive markers that indicated it had belonged to a young adult. Rebecca sat back on her heels, her heart pounding with the realization of what she had discovered. Her scientific training immediately took over, and she began documenting the find with her camera, taking multiple photographs from different angles while being careful not to disturb the site further. She knew this was potentially a crime scene that required professional forensic investigation. But her discovery was far from complete. As she continued to carefully excavate the immediate area, following proper archaeological protocols she had learned during her graduate studies, more bones began to emerge from the sandy soil. She found rib bones, vertebrae, and fragments that suggested the remains had been buried for several years and possibly disturbed by the natural processes of flood, freeze, and animal activity. The bones were scattered across an area of approximately 10 feet, suggesting either deliberate dispersal or natural distribution over time. Each piece she uncovered was carefully photographed and GPS marked before being gently placed in evidence containers she carried for collecting biological samples during her research. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across the canyon floor, Rebecca made a discovery that transformed her archaeological curiosity into genuine terror. She was carefully clearing soil from what appeared to be a section of spinal column when she uncovered something that made her recoil in shock and disbelief. Embedded directly between two lumbar vertebrae was a piece of metal, corroded and ancient-looking but unmistakably man-made. It wasn't a modern tool or piece of equipment. The object was crude and primitive, hand-forged with the distinctive characteristics of early metallurgy. As Rebecca cleaned away more of the encrusted soil and mineral deposits, the shape became horrifyingly clear. It was an arrowhead, but unlike any hunting point she had ever encountered in museum collections or archaeological sites. The design was brutal and utilitarian, featuring wicked barbs specifically engineered to prevent removal once embedded in a target. The metal showed extensive corrosion, but the craftsmanship suggested someone with significant knowledge of primitive weapon construction. The implications hit Rebecca with devastating clarity. This wasn't an archaeological find from an ancient hunting site. The bone showed characteristics of modern human remains, and the context of the discovery location, combined with the 5-year timeline since Sofia and Marcus had vanished, suggested a connection that was too significant to ignore. Rebecca immediately recognized that she had potentially discovered evidence related to the missing honeymoon couple. The remote location, the buried remains, and most chillingly, the primitive weapon embedded in human bone suggested that their disappearance hadn't been an accident or misadventure. This was evidence of violence, and the archaic nature of the weapon raised questions that seemed to belong to another century. She secured Sage, who was still showing extreme agitation, and used her satellite communication device to contact Park Service Dispatch. Her voice was steady but strained, as she reported the discovery of human remains with embedded metallic objects in a location far from any established trails or known archaeological sites. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, helicopters were carrying forensic specialists, law enforcement investigators, and equipment to the remote canyon location. The site was sealed and secured as a potential crime scene, with investigators establishing a perimeter that would preserve any additional evidence that might be present. Elena Rivera received the call from Washington County Sheriff's Office at 6:30 p.m. on September 12. The voice on the other end was gentle but direct, explaining that human remains had been discovered in the Zion Wilderness area, and that preliminary analysis suggested they might be connected to her daughter's case. The words hit Elena like a physical blow. For 5 years, she had lived in the terrible limbo of not knowing, clinging to increasingly faint hopes that Sofia and Marcus might somehow still be alive, perhaps suffering from amnesia or being held somewhere against their will. The discovery of remains meant the end of hope, but it also promised something she had desperately needed: answers. The forensic investigation at the canyon site continued for 3 days, with specialists working in rotating shifts to carefully excavate and document every piece of evidence. The remote location required helicopter support for personnel and equipment transport, making the operation logistically complex and expensive. But the importance of the discovery justified the extraordinary effort. In addition to the initial bone and arrowhead find, investigators uncovered additional skeletal remains that suggested 2 individuals, along with fragments of modern clothing and equipment that appeared consistent with hiking gear from 2018. Most significantly, they found a corroded but still recognizable metal object that had been buried alongside the remains. Marcus's distinctive titanium wedding ring, custom engraved with Sofia's initials and their wedding date. The ring provided the definitive identification that connected the discovered remains to the missing couple. The arrowhead embedded in the spine was carefully removed and transported to the State Crime Laboratory for detailed analysis. Initial examination revealed that while the weapon appeared ancient in design and construction, the metallurgy was consistent with modern steel that had been deliberately treated and aged to appear primitive. This finding was particularly disturbing because it suggested premeditation and sophisticated knowledge of both weapon construction and forensic countermeasures. Someone had crafted a primitive-appearing weapon using modern materials, then used it to kill 2 innocent people before carefully burying the evidence in one of the most inaccessible locations in the Utah wilderness. The investigation now shifted from a missing persons case to a double homicide inquiry. But the nature of the weapon and the remote burial location suggested they were dealing with a perpetrator unlike any in recent criminal history. The killer had demonstrated extensive knowledge of the wilderness area, primitive weapon construction, and forensic evidence disposal. As news of the discovery spread through the search and rescue community and local media outlets, a chilling realization began to emerge. The sophistication of the concealment and the archaic nature of the weapon suggested this might not be an isolated incident. Investigators began reviewing unsolved disappearances throughout the region, looking for patterns that might indicate a serial killer operating in America's most remote wilderness areas. The forensic analysis of the arrowhead would prove to be the key that unlocked a horror story spanning decades. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the state's leading forensic anthropologist, had examined thousands of artifacts throughout her career But the weapon recovered from Marcus Chen's vertebrae was unlike anything in her professional experience. Under microscopic analysis, the arrowhead revealed a troubling combination of ancient design principles and modern construction techniques. The base metal was contemporary steel, likely sourced from automotive or construction materials, but it had been hand-forged using traditional blacksmithing methods that required extensive knowledge of primitive metallurgy. The shaping showed tool marks consistent with stone hammers and primitive anvils. Most disturbing of all, the metal had been deliberately aged through a complex chemical process that included burial in acidic soil, exposure to specific mineral compounds, and careful weathering techniques that would require months or years to achieve the authentic appearance of an archaeological artifact. This wasn't the work of an impulsive killer. The weapon represented dedicated craftsmanship, extensive research into historical construction methods, and a level of premeditation that suggested a deeply disturbed individual with both the knowledge and patience to create authentic-appearing primitive weapons specifically for use in violent crimes. Dr. Mitchell's report landed on the desk of Detective Raymond Cole, a 20-year veteran of the Washington County Sheriff's Office who specialized in complex criminal investigations. Cole had worked missing persons cases throughout the region, but the Chen Rivera murders presented unique challenges that pushed beyond conventional investigative techniques. The primitive weapon, combined with the remote burial location and the sophisticated concealment methods, suggested they were dealing with someone who understood both modern forensic science and ancient hunting techniques. Cole began expanding the investigation, reaching out to experts in primitive skills, archaeology, and historical weapon construction. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. James Whitehorse, a professor of Native American Studies at Southern Utah University, contacted the sheriff's office after seeing media reports about the discovered arrowhead. Dr. Whitehorse, who was part Paiute and had spent decades studying traditional hunting and warfare techniques, recognized something significant in the weapon's construction. According to Dr. Whitehorse, the arrowhead design was not authentically Native American. While it incorporated elements from various tribal hunting point styles, the combination was historically inaccurate and culturally confused. It appeared to be the work of someone who had studied indigenous weapons but had mixed design elements from different tribes and time periods in ways that no authentic craftsman would combine. More importantly, Dr. Whitehorse revealed that similar weapons had been discovered at other crime scenes throughout the Four Corners region over the past 15 years. He had been contacted by law enforcement agencies in Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona about comparable primitive weapons used in unsolved homicides and disappearances. This revelation transformed the investigation from an isolated double murder into recognition of a potential serial killer who had been operating across multiple state jurisdictions for over a decade. Detective Cole immediately initiated contact with law enforcement agencies throughout the region, requesting case files for any unsolved crimes involving primitive weapons or unexplained disappearances in wilderness areas. The pattern that emerged was chilling in its scope and sophistication. Between 2008 and 2023, at least 12 separate incidents across 4 states involved victims who had vanished while hiking or camping in remote areas, only to be discovered years later with evidence of violence from primitive weapons. The victims were predominantly young couples or small groups, always experienced outdoor enthusiasts who understood wilderness safety protocols. In every case, their campsites had been found undisturbed, with all survival equipment present and no signs of struggle. The bodies were invariably discovered miles from their last known locations, buried in areas so remote that discovery was often accidental and occurred years after the disappearances. Most disturbing of all, the weapons recovered from multiple crime scenes showed the same distinctive characteristics. Modern materials crafted using primitive techniques, deliberately aged to appear ancient, and designed with maximum lethality rather than hunting efficiency. Someone was systematically stalking and killing outdoor enthusiasts using weapons that required extensive specialized knowledge to construct. The FBI was brought into the investigation as the multi-state pattern became clear. Special Agent Maria Santos, who specialized in serial crimes in remote areas, arrived in Utah to coordinate the expanding investigation. Agent Santos had worked similar cases involving killers who specifically targeted wilderness areas. understanding that the remote locations provided natural concealment for their crimes. The profile that emerged was deeply unsettling. The killer was likely a middle-aged male with extensive wilderness experience, possibly someone who lived full-time or part-time in remote areas. He possessed advanced knowledge of primitive weapon construction, understood modern forensic techniques well enough to avoid leaving conventional evidence, and had developed sophisticated methods for stalking and ambushing victims without leaving traces at their campsites. Most chillingly, the pattern suggested he had been refining his techniques over many years, becoming increasingly skilled at selecting victims and disposing of evidence in ways that virtually guaranteed the crimes would remain unsolved. The psychological profile developed by FBI behavioral analysts painted a picture of an individual driven by a twisted ideology that combined survivalist philosophy with violent territorial instincts. The killer appeared to view modern outdoor enthusiasts as invaders who needed to be eliminated using traditional methods that honored what he perceived as the ancient ways of the land. Agent Santos established a task force headquarters in St. George, Utah, coordinating with law enforcement agencies across the region to share intelligence and develop a comprehensive timeline of the killer's activities. The investigation revealed a disturbing pattern of escalation, with attacks becoming more frequent and more sophisticated over the 15-year timeline. The earliest known incident had occurred in 2008 near Mesa Verde National Park in Colorado, where a solo backpacker had been found 3 years later with a crude stone-tipped spear embedded in his chest. At the time, investigators had assumed it was an isolated incident, possibly related to a dispute over archaeological artifact theft. But as the task force compiled data from multiple jurisdictions, the connections became undeniable. The victims were always outdoor enthusiasts in their 20s or 30s, always found in extremely remote locations, and always killed with handmade primitive weapons that showed increasing sophistication over time. The killer's knowledge of wilderness areas was encyclopedic. He had selected burial sites that were virtually inaccessible to conventional search efforts, often in slot canyons, hidden caves, or areas that required technical climbing skills to reach. The geographic distribution suggested someone who was either highly mobile or had intimate knowledge of wilderness areas across multiple states. More disturbing still was the evidence that the killer had been observing his victims before attacking. In several cases, investigators found evidence of long-term surveillance, including hidden caches of supplies and observation posts that overlooked popular camping areas. The killer had been patient, methodical, and utterly ruthless in his selection and stalking of targets. The investigation into Sofia and Marcus's murders revealed additional horrifying details about their final hours. Forensic analysis of the campsite, using techniques not available during the original 2018 search, uncovered microscopic evidence that had been missed by the initial investigation. Soil samples from around their tent revealed traces of an unknown organic compound that appeared to be some form of natural sedative or paralytic agent, possibly derived from desert plants. The implications were terrifying. The killer had somehow incapacitated the couple at their campsite, then transported them 8 miles through difficult terrain to the burial location. This discovery explained the pristine condition of their camp and the absence of any signs of struggle. Sofia and Marcus had likely been rendered unconscious through some form of plant-based poison before being moved to the remote canyon where they were ultimately killed and buried. The killer's knowledge of desert botany and traditional plant-based medicines suggested someone with extensive training in primitive survival skills, possibly learned through survivalist groups, primitive skills schools, or academic study of indigenous practices. As the investigation deepened, a pattern of geographic connection began to emerge. Many of the attack locations were situated near areas of known archaeological significance. Ancient cliff dwellings, petroglyph sites, or locations that held spiritual importance to indigenous peoples. The killer appeared to be operating under some twisted belief system that positioned him as a guardian of these sacred places, eliminating modern visitors who he perceived as desecrating the ancient landscape. This ideological component added another layer of complexity to the investigation, suggesting they were dealing with someone driven by deeply held but fundamentally distorted beliefs about wilderness preservation and cultural protection. The task force began working with anthropologists and historians to identify locations throughout the region that might hold similar significance, hoping to predict where the killer might strike next. But the vast scope of the Four Corners wilderness area, encompassing millions of acres of remote terrain, made prevention efforts extraordinarily challenging. Meanwhile, the families of Sofia Rivera and Marcus Chen finally had confirmation of their worst fears, but also the beginning of justice. Elena Rivera's 5-year vigil of hope and searching had ended with devastating finality, but the discovery meant that their killer might finally face accountability for his crimes. The investigation had evolved from a missing persons case into one of the most complex serial murder investigations in the history of the American Southwest. The killer had managed to operate for over 15 years, claiming at least 12 confirmed victims, while remaining completely undetected by law enforcement. But his mistake had been in underestimating the persistence of modern forensic science and the dedication of families who refused to accept that their loved ones had simply vanished. The discovery of Sofia and Marcus's remains had provided the breakthrough that connected crimes across multiple states and decades, exposing a pattern of violence that had been hidden in America's most remote wilderness areas. As autumn arrived in southern Utah, the investigation entered a new phase focused on identifying and apprehending one of the most elusive killers in modern American criminal history. The hunt for the primitive predator who had turned the nation's most beautiful wilderness areas into his personal hunting preserve was about to begin in earnest. The breakthrough in identifying the killer came from an unexpected intersection of modern technology and ancient craft. Dr. Kevin Ramirez, a materials scientist at the University of Utah, had been analyzing the metallurgy of the arrowhead found embedded in Marcus Chen's spine when he made a discovery that would crack the case wide open. The primitive weapon, while designed to appear ancient, contained trace elements that were distinctly modern and geographically specific. The steel had been alloyed with rare earth metals that were used in specialized industrial applications, and the specific combination of elements pointed to a very limited number of potential sources throughout the Southwest. More critically, Dr. Ramirez discovered microscopic traces of a proprietary coating that was used exclusively by a single manufacturer of high-end camping and survival equipment. The coating was designed to prevent corrosion in extreme environments, but it had been deliberately removed from the arrowhead through chemical processes that still left identifiable molecular signatures. This finding meant that the killer had likely acquired his raw materials from stolen or repurposed outdoor equipment, possibly camping gear that had been taken from previous victims or purchased through legitimate channels that could be traced. Agent Santos immediately initiated a comprehensive investigation into suppliers of specialized camping equipment and primitive skills educational programs throughout the region. The search focused on individuals who had purchased unusual combinations of modern outdoor gear and primitive crafting supplies, particularly those with access to metallurgy equipment and chemical agents needed for the aging process. The investigation also examined enrollment records for primitive skill schools, survivalist training programs, and archaeological field studies that might have provided the killer with his extensive knowledge. Meanwhile, the task force had established a pattern analysis center that was mapping the killer's activities across 15 years and 4 states. Using geographic information systems and behavioral analysis, they identified a clear progression in the killer's techniques and target selection that revealed disturbing insights into his psychology and methods. The earliest attacks had been crude and opportunistic, suggesting someone learning through trial and error. But over time, the killer had developed increasingly sophisticated surveillance techniques, more effective weapons, and nearly foolproof disposal methods. The escalation indicated someone who was not only intelligent and patient, but who derived satisfaction from perfecting his craft. Agent Santos received the crucial tip on October 15, 2023. A clerk at a specialty metallurgy supply company in Flagstaff, Arizona, had been following the media coverage of the primitive weapon murders and remembered a customer who had made unusual purchases over several years. The customer, who had always paid in cash and provided minimal personal information, had repeatedly bought specific types of steel rod, chemical aging compounds, and forge equipment. More significantly, the clerk remembered that the man had once mentioned being disappointed by the softness of modern outdoor enthusiasts and had expressed beliefs about the need to teach them the old ways. The description provided by the clerk, combined with security camera footage from the supply store, led investigators to identify 53-year-old Thomas Brightfeather, a man who lived in a remote compound near the Arizona-Utah border. Brightfeather had legally changed his name from Thomas Williams 15 years earlier, coinciding almost exactly with the timeline of the first known murders. Public records revealed that Brightfeather owned 160 acres of isolated desert property that bordered national forest land, providing him with unlimited access to wilderness areas and complete privacy for his activities. He had no criminal record, no employment history, and no social media presence, living entirely off-grid through a combination of military disability payments and income from crafting and selling primitive hunting equipment to survivalist enthusiasts. The compound itself was a fortress of self-sufficiency, featuring solar power, rainwater collection, underground storage bunkers, and multiple escape routes into the surrounding wilderness. When FBI tactical teams surrounded the property on October 18th, they discovered that Brightfeather had vanished, apparently warned by some instinct or surveillance system that his discovery was imminent. Inside his workshop, investigators found a horrifying museum of violence. The building contained dozens of primitive weapons in various stages of construction, detailed maps of national parks and wilderness areas throughout the Southwest, and surveillance photographs of hiking couples taken from concealed positions over many years. Most chilling of all was a leather-bound journal that documented his crimes with clinical precision. Written in meticulous handwriting, the journal described each attack in detail, including his methods for stalking victims, his techniques for approaching campsites undetected, and his philosophical justifications for what he called teaching lessons about wilderness respect. The journal revealed that Brightfeather viewed himself as a protector of sacred landscapes, believing that modern hikers were desecrating ancient places through their presence. He had developed an elaborate belief system that positioned him as a warrior defending the land using traditional methods that honored what he perceived as the proper relationship between humans and wilderness. His entries about Sofia and Marcus were particularly disturbing, revealing that he had been observing their honeymoon campsite for 2 full days before attacking. He had noted their disrespectful behavior, including their use of electronic devices, their failure to conduct what he considered proper ceremonies before camping, and their plans to explore areas he deemed sacred. The journal described how he had used a plant-based paralytic derived from jimsonweed and other desert species to incapacitate the couple while they slept. He had then transported them, still alive but unconscious, to what he called his teaching place in the remote canyon where their remains were eventually discovered. The FBI manhunt for Thomas Brightfeather became one of the largest wilderness pursuits in recent history. His intimate knowledge of the terrain, combined with survival skills developed over decades of off-grid living, made him an extraordinarily elusive fugitive. He had prepared multiple hideouts throughout the region and had demonstrated an ability to move undetected through areas that challenged even experienced military tracking specialists. The search involved helicopter surveillance, ground teams with tracking dogs, thermal imaging technology, and coordination with tribal police who understood the traditional hiding places and water sources that Brightfeather might utilize. But the killer had seemingly vanished into the landscape as completely as his victims once had. For Elena Rivera and the Chen family, the discovery of Brightfeather's journal provided the answers they had desperately needed, but also revealed the horrifying reality of Sofia and Marcus's final hours. The young couple had been targeted not for anything they had done wrong, but simply because they represented what a deranged individual viewed as contamination of the sacred wilderness. The journal entries revealed that Brightfeather had been planning their murders from the moment he first observed them setting up camp, that their deaths had been inevitable regardless of their behavior or respect for the environment. They had encountered pure evil in a place they had chosen for its beauty and isolation. 3 weeks into the manhunt, a park ranger in Arches National Park reported suspicious activity near a remote water source. Boot prints in distinctive patterns and evidence of recent campfires suggested someone was moving through the area on foot, avoiding roads and established trails. The tactical response was swift and overwhelming. FBI teams surrounded the area while helicopter units monitored possible escape routes. After 15 years of evading justice, Thomas Brightfeather was finally cornered in a slot canyon where he had been preparing another primitive weapon, apparently planning to continue his campaign of wilderness terror. His arrest was anticlimactic after the massive investigation that had consumed hundreds of personnel and millions of dollars. Brightfeather offered no resistance, seemingly resigned to his capture. During his initial interrogation, he showed no remorse for his crimes, instead expressing frustration that modern society had failed to understand his mission to protect the sacred landscape from desecration. The case against him was overwhelming. The journal provided detailed confessions to multiple murders. The physical evidence linked him directly to the weapons and burial sites, and his workshop contained trophies from victims spanning 15 years of killing. On March 14, 2024, Thomas Brightfeather was sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole for the murders of Sofia Rivera and Marcus Chen, along with 10 other confirmed victims. Additional charges were pending in multiple jurisdictions as investigators continued to link him to unsolved cases throughout the region. For Elena Rivera, the conclusion of the case brought a complex mixture of relief and continued grief. Justice had been served, but Sofia and Marcus were still gone, their promising lives cut short by an encounter with madness in a place they had chosen for its beauty and meaning to their new marriage. The wilderness areas where Brightfeather had operated slowly returned to their natural rhythms, but the knowledge of what had happened there lingered like a shadow over the red rock landscape. The case had revealed that even in an age of GPS tracking and satellite communication, ancient evils could still find ways to claim innocent lives. Sofia and Marcus's story became a testament to the importance of never giving up hope for answers, even when those answers came years later and revealed truths more horrible than anyone had imagined. Their families finally had closure, but the cost of that knowledge would remain with them forever. A reminder that some honeymoons end not with happily ever after, but with a descent into unthinkable darkness.